The winter of 1847 holds a story of remarkable resilience buried beneath its snows. In the brutal wilderness of the Colorado Territory, where survival demanded every human sense be alert to danger, one woman's journey would defy all expectations. This is the extraordinary tale of Sarah Holloway, who lost her sight to fever but found her courage in darkness, and running elk, a Cherokee scout whose vision extended far beyond what eyes could see. Abandoned and facing certain death in a merciless blizzard, Sarah's story became a testament to the indomitable human spirit and the unexpected bonds formed when all hope seems lost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. December 1847 painted the Colorado Territory in shades of white and gray, a beautiful yet deadly landscape that forgave no weakness. The wagon train crawled westward along the foothills, 16 families seeking fortune in California's promised lands, their possessions and hopes packed tightly beneath canvas covers dusted with snow. Sarah Holloway sat perched on the edge of the last wagon, her gloved fingers tracing the rough wooden planks beneath her. Through her eyes remained open, they registered nothing but the faintest differences between light and shadow, the lingering echoes of sight that typhoid fever had left her 5 years ago. At 37, she had learned to navigate her darkness with quiet determination, building a world through touch, sound, and memory. "Keep moving," Silas Cooper bellowed from the front of the caravan, his voice cutting through the whistling wind. 2 more miles to Evergreen Pass before the real storm hits." Sarah pulled her woolen scarf tighter around her face, the fabric stiff with frozen breath. The temperature had plummeted since dawn, and the gentle snowfall had transformed into something more ominous. Even without sight, she could sense the change. The way sound dampened as snow accumulated, the shift in the wind's pitch as it funneled through narrowing passages, the nervous whinnies of horses sensing danger ahead. "How bad is it looking, Abigail?" Sarah asked, turning toward where she knew her cousin's wife sat clutching the reins. "Bad enough," Abigail Miller replied, her voice tight with barely contained fear. "The sky's gone the color of a bruise. Silas keeps saying we'll outrun it. But I don't see how." Sarah nodded, familiar with the wagon master's stubborn optimism. Silas Cooper had faced mountain winters before, but his eagerness to reach California before spring had pushed their departure too late in the season. A decision that now seemed increasingly foolhardy as the wind strengthened around them. "Jonathan thinks we should have stayed in Fort Collins," Abigail continued, mentioning her husband, Sarah's cousin, who had reluctantly become her caretaker after her parents' deaths. "Says Silas is gambling with all our lives." Something in Abigail's tone made Sarah stiffen. The subtle note of resentment when referring to her care had grown more pronounced in recent weeks. The Millers had taken her in after her parents succumbed to the same fever that claimed her sight. But their charity had calmed into obligation over time. They had sold her family's Nebraska farm, her inheritance, to finance this journey west, promising her a fresh start. But promises, like winter sunlight, had proven weak and fleeting. The wagon jolted violently, nearly throwing Sarah from her perch. She clutched the sideboards, heart racing. "Damned wheel caught a rock," Abigail muttered. "We're falling behind again." The implication hung in the freezing air between them. The last wagon, the slow wagon. The wagon was weighed down by a blind woman's presence. Shouts erupted from the front of the caravan, urgent commands barely audible through the rising howl of the wind. The wagon lurched to a halt, and Sarah heard the crunch of boots approaching through thickening snow. "Cooper's called an emergency meeting," Jonathan Miller announced, his breath coming in white clouds. "Storm's moving faster than expected. We need to make decisions." "What kind of decisions?" Sarah asked, already suspecting the answer. Jonathan hesitated, the pause speaking volumes. "Survival decisions, Sarah. I need to go up front. Stay here with Abigail." Sarah listened to his retreating footsteps, each crunch growing fainter as distance and snowfall swallowed the sound. The wind had taken on a voice of its own, a keening wail that scraped against her nerves. She had weathered storms before, but this one carried a different quality, a primal, hungry force that seemed to search for weaknesses. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour before Jonathan returned, accompanied by heavy footsteps she recognized as Silas Cooper's distinctive gait. "Mrs. Holloway," Cooper began, his usual booming voice subdued. "We're facing a choice no wagon master wants to make. The pass ahead is narrowing, and the storm is becoming a full blizzard. If we push through now, we might make the valley beyond, where there's shelter in the pines. Or," Sarah prompted when he paused, "or we hunker down here, but we're exposed. No fuel for fires, minimal shelter." His voice lowered further. "Either way, we need to lighten the loads. Anything non-essential stays behind." The unspoken question lingered. What was essential on a desperate flight through a mountain pass? "I understand," Sarah said quietly. "Do what you must." "Sarah," Jonathan interjected, a strange mixture of relief and guilt coloring his voice. "We've discussed it. The Petersons have room in their wagon for our supplies. The Millers can ride with the Taylors." The careful omission of her name struck Sarah like a physical blow. "And what of me, cousin?" Another terrible pause. "There's a trapper's cabin half a mile back," Cooper said finally. "Abandoned years ago, but the walls are still standing. You could wait out the storm there. We'd send help once we've reached the settlement." The cold that seeped into Sarah's bones had nothing to do with the plummeting temperature. "You're leaving me behind." "It's not like that," Jonathan insisted, though his voice betrayed him. "It's your best chance, Sarah. The wagon won't make it through the pass. You'd be at risk trying to transfer between moving vehicles in this weather." "My best chance," she repeated, the words hollow. "Or yours." Abigail made a small, distressed sound, but offered no defense. "We don't have time to debate this," Cooper cut in. "Storm's closing in fast. Miller, gather what she'll need. Food, blankets, matches. I'll have 2 men escort her to the cabin." Sarah sat motionless as activity erupted around her, numb with the realization that had been building for months. She wasn't family. She was a burden. Not a woman who had adapted to blindness with courage and determination, but an inconvenience whose value had been measured and found wanting. Within 20 minutes, she found herself standing in knee-deep snow, a pack of meager supplies thrust into her hands, the rough bark of a pine tree at her back. The sounds of the wagon train, creaking wood, jingling harnesses, shouted commands, grew fainter as they continued toward the pass without her. "Cabins just through those trees," a man she recognized as the blacksmith's son told her, his voice strained with awkward guilt. "Follow the rope we've tied to the trees, straight line maybe 200 paces. Something rough and fibrous was pressed into her free hand, a coarse rope staked to the ground. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Holloway," the young man added. "Truly." Then he was gone, his footsteps quickly swallowed by the intensifying storm. Sarah stood alone, the wind tearing at her clothes, snow already accumulating on her shoulders and hair. The enormity of her abandonment crashed over her like an icy wave. They weren't coming back. No matter what promises were made, she knew the truth. The Millers had seized their opportunity to shed an unwanted responsibility. The storm provided the perfect excuse. Who could blame them for making such a difficult choice when facing death? Sarah's gloved fingers tightened around the rope. Rage flared briefly, then transformed into something more useful, determination. If she was to die here, it wouldn't be standing in the snow waiting for rescue that would never come. She began to move, following the rope through deepening snow, each step a battle against the growing blizzard. The world had narrowed to the space between heartbeats, between labored breaths that crystallized instantly in the frigid air. There was only the rope, the next step, and the will to continue. The first fall came suddenly, her foot plunging through snow into an unseen depression. Sarah crashed to her knees, the pack slipping from her grasp. Panic surged as her hands scrambled blindly through the snow, desperate to recover both the rope and her supplies. Her fingers, already numb despite the gloves, finally closed around the rough fiber of the rope, but the pack remained elusive. "No," she gasped, the word instantly torn away by the wind. "No!" Without food or blankets, the cabin, if she even reached it, would become merely a more dignified place to die. As Sarah knelt in the deepening snow, the howling storm drowning out even the sound of her own ragged breathing, she faced the stark reality of her situation. Abandoned by family, fighting a merciless blizzard, with darkness both within and without. The Colorado wilderness, beautiful and brutal, made no allowances for human frailty, yet something beyond mere survival instinct stirred within her. A stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished by cold or betrayal. Sarah Holloway had not learned to navigate blindness by surrendering to circumstance. Inch by inch, she began to search for her pack, methodically sweeping her arms through the snow in expanding circles, the rope secured firmly around her wrist. The storm's fury intensified around her, as if nature itself were testing the limits of her resolve. And in that moment of desperate solitude, Sarah could not know that eyes were watching her from the forest edge. Eyes that belonged to someone who understood both wilderness and abandonment in ways she had yet to imagine. Time lost meaning as Sarah continued her desperate search through the snow. Her fingers, stiff and unresponsive inside her woolen gloves, finally brushed against the rough canvas of her pack. A small sob of relief escaped her lips as she clutched it to her chest. The meager supplies inside now as precious as gold. Rising to her knees, then unsteadily to her feet, Sarah resumed her journey along the rope line. The blizzard had transformed into something monstrous, a howling white beast that clawed at her clothes and threatened to devour her with each staggering step. Ice crystals formed on her eyelashes and in the loose strands of chestnut hair that had escaped her bonnet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 200 paces, she muttered through chattering teeth, counting each step aloud to maintain focus. The cold had begun to seep into her thoughts, making them sluggish and disjointed. Dangerous, she knew. The fever that took her sight had left her with unexpected knowledge. Her father had been a doctor, and in her years of blindness, she had committed his medical books to memory through her mother's patient readings. "Hypothermia first numbs the extremities," she recited mechanically, wiggling her toes inside her boots as she trudged forward. Then confusion sets in, false warmth, then unconsciousness, then death. The clinical words kept panic at bay, giving structure to the chaos of her situation. 57 paces, 58. Her world contracted to the count and the rope in her hand. At pace 116, the rope went slack. Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Carefully, she tugged on the line, confirming her worst fear. It had snapped, likely rotted through and unable to withstand the storm's violence. The lifeline that connected her to shelter had failed. For one terrible moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. Without the rope, without sight, she was truly lost in the heart of the blizzard. The cabin could be 10 feet away or in the wrong direction entirely. Disorientation swirled around her like the snow itself. Sarah forced herself to remain still, fighting against the animal instinct to run blindly forward. Think. She couldn't afford mistakes now. The wind shifted slightly, and with it came a new sound, a hollow moaning, different from the storm's constant roar. Sarah tilted her head, focusing all her attention on the sound. Years without sight had sharpened her other senses, none more than hearing. The moaning came again, and she realized it was wind passing through a structure. A chimney, perhaps. Abandoning. The broken rope. Sarah moved cautiously toward the sound, one arm extended before her to detect obstacles. The snow had deepened past her knees, each step requiring tremendous effort. Her breath came in painful gasps, the frigid air burning her lungs. Her outstretched fingers struck something solid. Rough-hewn logs, crusted with ice but unmistakably man-made. The trapper's cabin. Relief flooded through her as she felt her way along the wall, searching for the entrance. The door, when she found it, refused to budge at first, frozen shut and barricaded by a snowdrift. Sarah threw her weight against it repeatedly, desperation lending her strength. On the fourth attempt, it gave way with a crack of protesting ice, sending her stumbling into the cabin's dark interior. The relative stillness inside disoriented her momentarily. Though the wind still shrieked through gaps in the walls and what must be a partially collapsed roof, the direct assault of the blizzard had ceased. Sarah pushed the door closed behind her, hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. The air inside carried the musty scent of abandonment, dust, rotting wood, and something else she couldn't immediately identify. Animal droppings, perhaps. Clearly, the cabin had been vacant for years, just as Cooper had said. "Hello," she called out, an irrational hope that someone might already be sheltering inside. Only the wind answered, whistling through unseen cracks. Keeping one hand on the wall, Sarah began a careful exploration of her sanctuary. The cabin was small, perhaps 12 feet square. Her toe struck something metal, an overturned pot or pan, sending it skittering across what felt like a dirt floor. 3 steps forward, her shin collided painfully with what proved to be a crude table, still standing despite the cabin's dilapidation. Further investigation revealed a collapsed bed frame in one corner, its mattress long since claimed by rodents, and a stone fireplace along the far wall. Sarah's heart sank as her hands confirmed what she had already suspected. No firewood had been left behind, and the chimney appeared partially blocked. "At least it's shelter," she whispered to herself, unsure if the words were meant as encouragement or acknowledgement of how little comfort the cabin truly offered. Sarah's mind raced through calculations of survival. Without fire, the cabin would remain nearly as cold as the wilderness outside, merely blocking the wind and snow. Her pack contained food for perhaps 3 days if carefully rationed, a flint and steel she couldn't use without kindling, a single blanket, a small knife and a tin cup. The Millers had fulfilled the bare minimum of obligation, providing supplies that would keep her alive long enough to absolve their consciences, but not enough to truly survive. Exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed her. Sarah sank to the floor, back against the rough wall, knees drawn to her chest. For the first time since being abandoned, she allowed herself a moment of complete honesty. No one was coming back for her. The storm would last days, not hours, and even if the wagon train reached safety, there was little incentive for them to risk lives returning for a blind woman who represented nothing but burden. "I am going to die here," she said aloud, her voice steady despite the finality of the words. Strangely, the acknowledgement brought a certain clarity. If these were to be her final days, she would face them with the same dignity with which she had faced blindness. Sarah unwrapped her pack, organizing its contents methodically beside her. She removed her snow-crusted outer garments, knowing that wet clothing would only hasten heat loss. Wrapping herself in the single wool blanket, Sarah chewed a small piece of jerky from her rations, allowing herself the luxury of a few sips of water from her canteen. Then, huddled against the wall furthest from the door's draft, she prepared for the long night ahead. Outside, the blizzard reached its full fury. The walls of the cabin creaked and groaned under its assault, and snow began to drift through the gaps in the roof. Sarah estimated it must be near nightfall, though darkness and light made little difference to her world. As the hours crawled by, the cold penetrated deeper, settling into her bones. Sarah kept herself awake by reciting passages from books her mother had read to her, Shakespeare, the Bible, her father's medical texts. The words were a tenuous connection to a world that seemed increasingly distant. To be or not to be, she whispered through numb lips. That is the question. A new sound cut through her recitation, and the storm's constant howl, the distinct crack of breaking wood nearby. Sarah stiffened, suddenly alert. Not the cabin settling or surrendering to the blizzard, something deliberate, something outside. Her mind supplied terrifying possibilities, bears seeking shelter, wolves drawn by the scent of food in her pack, or perhaps desperate men with intentions worse than any predator. In her condition, blind, freezing, weaponless save for a small knife, she stood no chance against any threat. The sound came again, closer now. Footsteps, heavy but measured, approaching the cabin door. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, clutching the knife with fingers too numb to be effective. The blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, as if its threadbare protection might somehow render her invisible. The door creaked open, sending a swirl of snow and bitter wind into the cabin. Sarah held her breath, the knife trembling in her grasp. Heavy footsteps entered, then paused. She could sense a presence, powerful and still, assessing the cabin's interior. When the intruder finally spoke, his voice was deep and measured, carrying an accent she couldn't immediately place. Not the rough drawl of mountain men or the clipped efficiency of Easterners like Cooper. You are far from your people, blind one. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her useless eyes widening in the darkness. How did he know? How could he tell? She was blind in this lightless cabin. They left me, she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper. The storm. They left me to die. A moment of silence followed, heavy with unspoken judgment, not for her, but for those who had abandoned her. Then the stranger moved, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. Night deepens, cold strengthens. You will not survive until dawn. It wasn't a threat, merely a statement of fact, delivered with the same matter-of-fact certainty as one might remark on the weather. Sarah found herself responding with equal honesty. I know. Another silence, then the rustle of movement as the stranger crouched somewhere in the darkness. Sarah could sense his proximity, smell leather and smoke, and something herbal on his clothes. I am called Joseph Blackhawk by those who trade at the fort, the voice said. My people, the Cherokee, know me as Waiadihi, Stalking Wolf. Sarah Holloway, she replied, offering her name as if they were meeting at a church social rather than in a collapsing cabin during a blizzard. The absurdity of maintaining such civility struck her suddenly, and an unexpected laugh escaped her, lips quickly stifled by the gravity of her situation. Waiadihi, Joseph, made no comment on her inappropriate laughter. Instead, she heard him moving purposefully around the cabin, assessing its condition with soft footfalls that betrayed a lifetime of moving silently through wilderness. This shelter fails, he finally pronounced. Roof breaks, walls leak, fire is impossible. I'm aware, Sarah replied, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. I don't need sight to know when I'm freezing to death. A pause followed her sharp words, then, surprisingly, a sound that might have been a brief, dry chuckle. You have spirit, blind woman. Good. Spirit fights when body weakens. Something heavy dropped to the floor near her, a pack much larger than her own, from the sound of it. Sarah tensed as Joseph approached, unsure of his intentions despite his calm. Demeanor, I have shelter, he said. 2 miles west, strong walls, fire, food. Hope flickered briefly in Sarah's chest before reality extinguished it. I can't travel 2 miles in this blizzard. I barely made it here. You will die if you stay, Joseph stated simply. I did not track you through snow to watch you freeze. Sarah's mind caught on his words. Track me? You followed me from the wagon train? 3 days I have watched your caravan, he explained. Cherokee scouts watch all who pass through these mountains. When they left you, I followed. Why? Sarah asked, the question encompassing both his surveillance and his decision to intervene. Joseph was silent for several moments. When he spoke again, his voice carried a complexity she hadn't detected before, a mixture of hardness and something almost like compassion. My grandmother went blind in her final winters. Among Cherokee, she remained an honored elder. Her wisdom was sought, her stories treasured. A subtle shift in his tone suggested disapproval. What your people did, not our way. Before Sarah could respond to this unexpected revelation, Joseph continued with practical efficiency. Decision comes. Now stay and die, or trust me and perhaps live. Choose. Put so bluntly, it hardly seemed a choice at all. Yet trust didn't come easily to Sarah anymore, not after the miller's betrayal, not after years of being treated as a burden rather than a person. How do I know I can trust you? She asked, her fingers still gripping the small knife, useless though it might be against this man. You don't, Joseph replied with refreshing honesty. But the storm doesn't care about trust. Death comes either way. Sarah considered her options, such as they were. The cabin grew colder by the minute as snow accumulated through the damaged roof. Her supplies would last 3 days at most, assuming she didn't freeze first. The stranger offered her only chance of survival, tenuous though it might be. I'll go with you, she finally decided. Good. The simple approval was followed immediately by practical instructions. Put on your wet clothes again, bad for cold but needed for a journey. I will bring dry furs for after. Sarah complied, grimacing as she pulled the damp, freezing layers back over her body. Joseph moved around the cabin, gathering her meager supplies and returning them to her pack. Keep your knife, he said, surprising her. Women alone should have weapons, even blind. Something about this matter-of-fact acknowledgement of both her vulnerability and her right to self-protection touched Sarah deeply. The Millers had confiscated her father's hunting knife years ago, claiming she might hurt herself. Can you stand? Joseph asked, approaching her again. Sarah pushed herself upright, legs trembling with cold and exhaustion. Yes, but I don't know how far I can walk, especially in this storm. Not walk, Joseph corrected. Too slow, too dangerous. I carry. Before Sarah could protest, strong arms lifted her effortlessly, one behind her back, the other beneath her knees. She instinctively clutched at his shoulder, feeling the surprising warmth radiating from him despite the bitter cold. My pack, she began. Already secured, he assured her. Now silence. Journey requires strength, not words. With that, he carried her to the door and out into the fury of the blizzard. The shock of the cold stole Sarah's breath. The winds howled, drowning any sound except Joseph's steady heartbeat against her ear. She tucked her face against his chest, grateful for the minimal shelter it provided against the stinging snow. Joseph moved with astonishing confidence through the storm-ravaged forest. Where Sarah had floundered in confusion, he navigated as if following a clear path, visible only to him. His stride remained steady, despite carrying her weight and their combined supplies, each footfall placed with deliberate certainty. Time blurred. As they traveled, Sarah drifted between alertness and a dangerous twilight consciousness, the cold seeping past all barriers of clothing and will. Only Joseph's occasional commands, hold tighter or shield your face now, anchored her to reality. When she began to feel an insidious warmth spreading through her limbs, Sarah recognized the dangerous sign of advancing hypothermia. I feel warm, she murmured against Joseph's shoulder. That's bad. His pace increased immediately. Stay awake, Sarah Holloway, he ordered, using her full name with emphasis. Talk now. Where did you come from before the mountains? The direct question required focus to answer. Nebraska. farm near Lincoln. Before that, Ohio. Why travel west in winter? Foolish time. Despite everything, Sarah found herself defending the caravan's decision. Silas Cooper, our wagon master, said we'd reach California before deep winter, said the passes would still be clear. Cooper knows nothing of these mountains, Joseph replied, his disdain evident, or he values gold more than lives. They pushed on through the blizzard, Joseph extracting Sarah's life story through persistent questioning whenever her responses began to fade or slur. She told him about her parents, her father's medical practice, the typhoid epidemic that claimed their lives and her sight, her subsequent dependence on the Millers. They sold your land, Joseph asked sharply when she mentioned her inheritance. Yes, Sarah confirmed, the old bitterness resurfacing. Jonathan said it was worthless without someone to work with. The money funded their journey west. My journey too, I suppose. Land is never worthless, Joseph stated with quiet certainty. They continued their arduous journey. The storm's character changed subtly. The wind's direction shifted, the snowfall lightening marginally. Sarah sensed they had entered a more sheltered area, a valley or ravine that offered some protection from the blizzard's full fury. Close now, Joseph confirmed when she mentioned this observation. You notice changes others miss. Good skill. The unexpected compliment warmed something in Sarah that had nothing to do with temperature. How long had it been since someone had acknowledged any skill of hers, any value beyond burden? After what seemed like hours of travel, Joseph's pace slowed. The sound of the wind changed again, suggesting they were approaching a structure. The crunch of snow beneath his feet gave way to solid thuds, a wooden platform or porch. We arrive, he announced, his voice betraying the first hints of exertion since beginning their journey. A door creaked open, and suddenly they were inside. The storm's howl muted to a distant wail. The atmosphere enveloped Sarah immediately. Warmth, the sharp scent of wood smoke, and countless other smells she couldn't immediately identify. Herbs, hanging to dry perhaps, and something like cured leather. Joseph set her down carefully on what felt like a bench or low platform, covered with furs infinitely softer than the threadbare blanket she'd had in the trapper's cabin. Remove wet clothes, he instructed, moving away from her. She heard him striking flint, followed by the welcome crackling of a fire being stoked to greater life. Dry furs beside you, then food, then sleep. Sarah hesitated, suddenly aware of her vulnerability, alone with a stranger about to disrobe. Joseph seemed to sense her discomfort. I turn away, he said simply. Honor requires it. Footsteps retreated to the far side of what she was beginning to realize was a surprisingly large shelter. True to his word, Joseph remained at a distance. As Sarah peeled off her frozen outer garments with shaking hands, wrapping herself in the luxurious furs she found neatly folded beside her. Only when she announced she was decent did Joseph return, pressing a wooden cup into her hands. The liquid inside steamed, carrying an unfamiliar herbal scent. Drink, he instructed. Pine needle tea prevents winter sickness. Sarah sipped cautiously. The tea was bitter but not unpleasant, warming her from within more effectively than she would have thought possible. Thank you, she said, the simple words wholly inadequate for what this man had done. You saved my life. Joseph was quiet for a moment. When he finally responded, his words carried a weight that suggested deeper meaning beyond their practical surface. Storm has passed for tonight, Sarah Holloway, but winter's journey has just begun. Dawn arrived with subtle shifts in the air rather than visible light. Sarah woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the previous day's events came rushing back. The furs enveloping her carried unfamiliar scents, cedar smoke, pine, and something musky that spoke of wilderness. She sat up cautiously, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. You wake up. Joseph's voice came from across the shelter, measured and calm. Fever did not claim you at night. Good sign. Sarah hadn't considered the possibility of fever, though. It made sense after such extended exposure to the cold. "Where exactly are we?" she asked, running her hands over the sleeping platform beneath her, constructing a mental image of her surroundings. "Cherokee Winter Hunting Lodge," Joseph explained, "built into the hillside, stone and timber, 3 generations old." The revelation surprised her. "I thought the Cherokee lived further south and east." "Most do." Something in his tone suggested complexity beyond those simple words. "Small bands travel north and west after the removal. Some, like me, scout between worlds." Sarah nodded, understanding that between worlds referred to more than just geography. The space between settler and native ways was fraught with danger and mistrust, yet Joseph navigated it with apparent ease. Her stomach growled audibly, reminding her that she'd eaten almost nothing the previous day. As if reading her thoughts, Joseph approached, his footsteps deliberately heavier than necessary, letting her track his movement, she realized. "Breakfast first," he said, pressing a wooden bowl into her hands. "Then we begin." "Begin what?" Sarah asked, inhaling the appealing aroma rising from the bowl, some kind of stew with meat and unfamiliar herbs. "Learning to survive," Joseph replied matter-of-factly. "Storm will return. Winter in the mountains lasts months, not days. Your people will not come back." The blunt assessment stung, though Sarah couldn't dispute its accuracy. "You could just point me toward the nearest settlement when the weather clears," she suggested, although the prospect of navigating alone filled her with dread. Joseph was silent for several moments. When he spoke, his voice carried quiet authority. "Nearest settlement is Fort Collins, 6 days' journey for someone who sees. For blind woman alone, impossible." "So I'm still a burden, just to you now instead of the Millers," Sarah said, unable to keep bitterness from her voice. "No." The single word landed with surprising force. "Not a burden. Student." "Student? Winter teaches or winter kills," Joseph said simply. "I will teach. You will learn. Whether you stay or go when spring comes is your choice." The unexpectedness of his proposal left Sarah momentarily speechless. No one, since her blindness, had suggested she could be anything but dependent. Yet this man she barely knew was offering not charity but education, skills, independence, choice. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally. "My reasons are my own," Joseph replied, then added in a softer tone, "Eat now. Food grows cold." The stew proved delicious. Venison, Sarah guessed, with roots and berries that created a complex flavor unlike anything from her previous life. She ate hungrily, suddenly ravenous, as her body demanded fuel to recover from its ordeal. "Good," Joseph approved when she finished. "Strength returns. Now we begin the first lesson." What followed was unlike anything in Sarah's experience. Joseph led her on a methodical exploration of the lodge, helping her create a mental map of its layout. The shelter was larger than she'd initially thought, a main room with the central fire pit, a smaller sleeping chamber dug into the hillside, and storage areas for food, weapons, and tools. 4 steps from sleeping furs to central fire, Joseph instructed. 7 steps from fire to door, 3 steps right from the door to the water storage. Sarah counted carefully, committing each measurement to memory. Unlike the clumsy guidance she'd received from the Millers, always being led, always dependent, Joseph taught her to navigate independently. "Cabin speaks to those who listen," he explained, showing her how different sections of the floor sounded distinct underfoot, how air currents mapped the space, how the fire's warmth created directional references. By midday, Sarah could move freely through the main areas of the lodge without assistance. Each successful navigation built a confidence she hadn't felt in years. "Now," Joseph announced, "outside." Sarah hesitated at the threshold, the memory of the blizzard's fury still fresh. Is it safe? Storm sleeps for now. Sun breaks through. You must learn land around shelter while weather permits. Bundled in dry clothes Joseph had provided, deerskin leggings beneath her wool dress, a fur-lined jacket, and moccasins infinitely more practical than her ruined boots, Sarah stepped cautiously outside. The air was crisp and cold, but lacked yesterday's lethal bite. Snow crunching underfoot, packed and firm rather than treacherously deep. Joseph placed a sturdy walking stick in her hands, demonstrating how to use it to detect obstacles before her feet found them. Sweep in a small arc, he instructed. Listen to the sound it makes against different surfaces. The walking stick became an extension of herself, providing information her eyes could not. Snow-covered ground, bare rock, ice, tree roots, each produced a distinctive sound when struck or dragged against. When the sun warms your face directly, you face south, Joseph taught her. Lodge opens eastward. Stream lies west and downhill. Throughout the afternoon, Joseph guided Sarah through increasingly complex lessons in wilderness orientation. He taught her to identify different trees by their bark texture, to recognize animal tracks by the depressions they left in snow, to tell which direction water flowed by its sound. Listen, he commanded frequently, falling silent to allow her to absorb the forest's subtle communications, the distinctive calls of birds indicating weather changes, the creak of branches suggesting wind direction, the distant crack of ice that marked the sun's warming influence. By the time they returned to the lodge, Sarah was exhausted, yet exhilarated. Her world, which had contracted dramatically when blindness took her sight, had paradoxically expanded in this wilderness far from civilization. As they shared a simple evening meal of dried berries and smoked fish, Sarah found herself reflecting on the day's lessons. "You teach differently than anyone I have known," she observed. "After I lost my sight, people either avoided me entirely or treated me like a child, incapable, helpless." Joseph considered this before responding. "Blindness is not weakness, Sarah Holloway. It is simply a different way of moving through the world." The simplicity of this perspective struck her deeply. Not diminished, just different. "Your hands," Joseph said unexpectedly. "Show them." Puzzled, Sarah extended her hands, palms up. Joseph's calloused fingers examined hers, turning them gently. "Soft," he observed. "Not used to working." Heat crept into Sarah's cheeks. "I wasn't permitted to do much. Rebecca, my cousin's wife, feared I would break things or hurt myself." "These hands must become stronger," Joseph said matter-of-factly. "Tomorrow we begin with small tasks: weaving, fire building, food preparation." "You believe I can do these things?" Sarah couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Years of enforced helplessness having taken their toll on her confidence. "I know you can," Joseph replied with quiet certainty. As darkness fell outside, a change Sarah sensed through the lodge's cooling air and the forest's shifting sounds, Joseph built up the fire for the night. The pleasant crackling and increased warmth signaled the day's end. "Rest now," he instructed. "Tomorrow brings new challenges." As Sarah settled onto her sleeping platform, wrapped in furs, infinitely more comfortable than anything she'd known. Since leaving Nebraska, an unexpected realization struck her. For the first time since losing her sight, someone looked at her and saw potential instead of burden. The revelation was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Whatever uncertain future lay before her, Sarah Holloway had already taken her first step toward a kind of freedom. Not despite her blindness, but with it as simply another facet of who she was. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the promise of returning snow. But within the lodge's sturdy walls, beside the crackling fire, Sarah fell asleep with the unfamiliar sensation of hope warming her more effectively than any flame. Days melted into one another as Sarah settled into a rhythm of learning and adaptation. The blizzard returned intermittently, sometimes confining them to the lodge for days, other times granting brief reprieves that Joseph immediately seized as opportunities for outdoor lessons. On the 10th day of her new life, Sarah successfully built her first fire without assistance. Her fingers, once soft and uncertain, had grown increasingly deft at arranging kindling, striking flint, and nurturing the precious spark into flame. When the fire caught, crackling to life beneath her hands, a sense of accomplishment surged through her that surpassed any she had known in her previous life. "Good," Joseph said simply, but Sarah detected a note of genuine approval in his typically understated voice. That evening, as snow fell gently outside, Sarah worked on weaving a small basket from river reeds Joseph had collected before the last storm. The task required concentration, but the repetitive patterns soothed her mind as her fingers grew increasingly confident with the unfamiliar craft. "I've never created anything useful before," she admitted, running her fingers over her work. The basket was crude compared to what Joseph could produce, but the reeds bent to her will more readily than they had when she first attempted the skill. "In my father's house, I played piano and embroidered decorative things. After losing my sight, I wasn't trusted to do even that much." Joseph made a non-committal sound, neither judgment nor pity. "Different skills for different worlds. Here, what you make keeps you alive." The practical wisdom of his perspective had become a comfort to Sarah. In the wilderness, worth was measured in capability and contribution, not social graces or appearances. Her blindness remained a challenge, but not a definition. "Someone approaches," Joseph said suddenly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Sarah froze, her hands stilling on the half-completed basket. "Who? How can you tell?" "Birds near." The ridge fell silent, then resumed in a pattern of alarm, he explained, moving silently to where she knew he kept his weapons. "Not Cherokee. They would announce themselves." Fear clenched Sarah's stomach. "The wagon train, returning to search for me." "No," Joseph replied, certainty in his voice. "Single rider, heavy on horse, armed." Sarah listened intently but could detect nothing beyond the gentle patter of snow against the lodge roof and the soft crackling of the fire. Joseph's senses, honed by a lifetime in the wilderness, perceived threats long before they became apparent to others. "Stay inside," he instructed, "no matter what you hear." Before she could protest, he had slipped out the door, closing it silently behind him. Sarah sat paralyzed with anxiety, straining her ears for any sound beyond the lodge walls. Minutes stretched interminably, marked only by the steadily burning fire and her own rapid heartbeat. Finally, she heard voices, Joseph's distinctive cadence and another unfamiliar and rough-edged. The conversation, though muffled by distance and the lodge walls, carried tensions she could sense even without distinguishing the words. The door opened abruptly, bringing a swirl of cold air and the scent of horse and unwashed human. Joseph entered first, his footsteps measured and deliberate. Another set followed, heavier, booted rather than moccasined. "Sarah Holloway," Joseph said formally, "this man claims to search for you. Mason Fletcher, United States Army Scout." Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't expected anyone from the caravan to actually mount a search, especially not a military scout. "Mrs. Holloway," Fletcher's voice was graveled and direct, with the accent of a Virginia upbringing poorly disguised beneath frontier roughness. "Thank the Lord you're alive. When Cooper's train reached Fort Collins without you, Captain Harrison authorized a search party." She felt his assessing gaze on her, taking in her deerskin-clad form and the half-finished basket in her lap. Despite her blindness, Sarah had always been acutely aware of being observed. "I'm surprised anyone bothered to look," she replied, unable to keep bitterness from her voice. "The Millers made their choice clear when they abandoned me. Fletcher cleared his throat uncomfortably. That's not exactly how they tell it, ma'am. According to the Millers, you were separated during the storm's height. They searched but assumed you'd perished. The bald-faced lie ignited a spark of anger in Sarah's chest. They left me deliberately at a trapper's cabin that was falling apart. They promised to send help once they reached safety. Help that never would have come if Joseph hadn't found me. An awkward silence followed her accusation. She could almost feel the tension between the two men as they stood on opposite sides of the lodge. "Be that as it may," Fletcher finally continued, "I've been sent to bring you to Fort Collins. There's a settlement of godly folk there who've agreed to take responsibility for your care." The implication was clear. A white woman, especially a blind one, had no business living with a Cherokee man, regardless of the circumstances. Sarah felt a surge of indignation at Fletcher's presumption. "I'm not a package to be handed from one caretaker to another, Mr. Fletcher," she said firmly. "I'm perfectly safe here, and Mr. Blackhawk has been teaching me to survive independently." Fletcher snorted. "Survive? A blind woman in the wilderness? With all due respect, Mrs. Holloway, that's impossible, and highly inappropriate." Joseph, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "Weather worsens, night comes. Your journey to the fort must wait until morning." It wasn't an invitation so much as a practical assessment, delivered with the quiet authority that Sarah had come to respect. Fletcher seemed about to object, but the rising howl of wind outside confirmed Joseph's prediction of deteriorating conditions. "Fine," Fletcher conceded grudgingly, "but we leave at first light, Mrs. Holloway. Captain Harrison's orders are clear." After a tense meal, where conversation was minimal and guarded, Fletcher retired to a corner of the lodge Joseph designated for him. Sarah could hear him cleaning his rifle, the metallic sounds a pointed reminder of the world of men and conflict that had intruded on her sanctuary. When Fletcher's breathing eventually deepened into sleep, Joseph approached Sarah where she sat. By the fire, his movements silent enough that only her heightened hearing detected his presence. "He lies," Joseph whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Not an army scout." Sarah's heart skipped. "How can you tell?" "Gear wrong." Questions. "Wrong. Army scouts know Cherokee words. Recognized tribal marks on lodge. He knows nothing." Joseph's voice hardened. "And why would the army send one man, not a search party, for blind woman?" The implications sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the winter night. "If he's not who he claims, then who is he, and what does he want with me?" Joseph was silent for a moment, considering. "His horse carries the Nebraska Territory brand, your cousin's name, Miller, scratched on the saddle." Sarah's mind raced to make connections. Jonathan Miller sent him? But why? They were eager enough to get rid of me before. "Land," Joseph said simply. "You mentioned inheritance. Papers needed, perhaps, or something on land worth more than they knew." The possibility struck Sarah forcefully. The Millers had been suspiciously eager to sell her father's property, insisting it was worthless, while simultaneously using the proceeds to finance their journey west. Had they discovered something afterward? Something that made them regret the sale? Something that required Sarah's signature or presence to claim? "What do we do?" she whispered. "Tonight, nothing. He sleeps with one eye open, hand near the gun." Joseph's voice carried grim certainty. "Tomorrow, be ready. I have a plan." The fire popped and hissed as they fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Sarah's mind whirled with possibilities and fears. The secure world she had begun to build with Joseph now faced a threat from her past, a past that apparently wasn't as eager to release her as she had believed. Outside, the storm intensified, snow piling against the lodge in drifts that would make travel treacherous, if not impossible. Yet Sarah sensed that the true danger now lay within their shelter, in the form of a man who carried lies as easily as he carried weapons. Fletcher's soft snore broke the silence, the sound incongruously peaceful given the tension his arrival had created. Sarah leaned closer to Joseph, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I won't go with him," she vowed quietly. Joseph's hand briefly covered hers, a gesture of solidarity more eloquent than words. "Sleep now," he counseled. "Morning brings choices. Choices bring consequences." As Sarah retired to her sleeping platform, keenly aware of the stranger's presence disrupting the harmony of the lodge, she reflected on how drastically her world had changed in less than 2 weeks. From abandoned burden to student of survival, she had begun to reclaim her sense of worth and capability. Now, that fragile new identity faced its first real test. Whatever Fletcher's true motives, whatever connection he had to the Millers and her past, Sarah was determined not to surrender the independence she had only just begun to taste. Tomorrow would indeed bring choices, and she intended to make ones that would shape her future on her own terms, not those dictated by others who saw her blindness as defining her worth. Dawn arrived with deceptive tranquility. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine landscape of untouched snow and crystal-clear air. Inside the lodge, tension hung thick as morning preparations began. Sarah woke to the sounds of Fletcher checking his weapons. The metallic click of a revolver being loaded, the soft scrape of a knife against a whetstone. Joseph moved about the lodge with deliberate steps, his normally silent movements now purposefully audible, marking his position for Sarah's benefit. "Weather clears," Joseph announced. "Your journey to the fort can begin, Scout Fletcher." Something in his emphasis on the title suggested skepticism that wasn't lost on Fletcher. "Good. Mrs. Holloway, are your belongings packed? We should leave within the hour." Sarah sat up, already dressed in the warm layers Joseph had taught her to wear for winter travel. "I told you last night, Mr. Fletcher. I'm not going with you." Fletcher's boot steps approached her platform. "This isn't a matter of choice, ma'am. Captain Harrison's orders are fabricated," Sarah interrupted boldly, "like your identity as an army scout." A dangerous silence followed her accusation. When Fletcher spoke again, his voice had shed its veneer of frontier civility, revealing something colder beneath. "The Millers were right about your stubbornness," he said. "Seems blindness hasn't made you any more biddable. Makes no difference. You're coming with me, one way or another." The threat hung in the air between them. Sarah held her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "And what exactly do the Millers want with me now? They were eager enough to abandon me before." Fletcher gave a humorless laugh. "Let's just say some paperwork needs your signature. Something about your father's property proving more valuable than anticipated." "I suspected as much," Sarah replied, careful to keep her voice steady. "What did they find on the land, Mr. Fletcher? Gold? Copper?" "Not your concern," Fletcher snapped. "Your only concern is coming with me peacefully, or what?" Joseph's voice cut through the tension closer than Sarah had realized. "You threatened blind woman in my lodge." Fletcher's stance shifted. Sarah could hear the subtle creak of leather as he turned to face Joseph. "This doesn't concern you, Indian. The woman belongs to her own kind." "I belong where I choose," Sarah interjected firmly, "and I choose to stay." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats. Then, surprisingly, Fletcher's tone softened to something almost reasonable. "Look, Mrs. Holloway, I understand you feel this Cherokee has helped you. I'm even willing to see he's compensated for his trouble, but surely you see you can't stay here. It's uncivilized, improper, and frankly, dangerous." "The only danger I've faced came from people like you," Sarah replied. "People who see my blindness as weakness to be exploited." Fletcher's patience visibly snapped. "Enough talk. We're leaving now." His hand clamped around Sarah's arm, fingers digging painfully into her flesh. What happened next unfolded with such speed that Sarah could barely track it. A rush of movement, a grunt of pain from Fletcher, and suddenly the pressure on her arm vanished. A heavy thud suggested Fletcher had hit the ground. "You'll regret that," Fletcher snarled, his voice now coming from below. "Leave now," Joseph commanded. "Tell Millers their scheme fails." The unmistakable sound of a hammer being cocked froze the room. "I'm not leaving without her." Sarah's breath caught. The situation had escalated beyond words to imminent violence. She sensed Joseph tensing beside her, calculating his response to the loaded weapon. "You shoot. You carry dead weight through mountain snow," Joseph observed calmly. "Your horse cannot manage both a live woman and a corpse. Not practical." The pragmatic assessment seemed to give Fletcher pause. Sarah heard him rise slowly to his feet, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. "This isn't over," he promised. "I'll be back with enough men to handle one lone Indian." "By then we'll be gone," Sarah said, the plan forming in her mind even. As she spoke, "Joseph, we need to leave as soon as he's gone. He'll bring others." Joseph made a sound of agreement. "Already prepared? Supplies packed while you slept." Fletcher's laugh held no humor. "Running won't help you, Mrs. Holloway. There's nowhere in these mountains you can hide that I won't find you." "Perhaps," Joseph replied evenly. "But many places you won't return from." The implicit threat hung in the air as Fletcher gathered his belongings, cursing under his breath. Sarah remained tense until she heard the door open and close, followed by the sound of a horse being mounted and ridden away at a gallop that spoke of both anger and urgency. "He leaves too easily," Joseph observed, concern evident in his voice. "Man like that doesn't surrender a prize without reason." "He's going for reinforcements," Sarah said, rising to her feet. "How much time do we have?" "Nearest settlement where he might find men willing to hunt Cherokee, 2 days' ride. If snow holds him back, perhaps 3. Joseph moved about the lodge with swift efficiency, gathering their belongings. "We leave within an hour. Where will we go?" Sarah asked, packing the few possessions she'd accumulated. The basket she'd woven, a bone comb Joseph had carved for her, her father's watch that had somehow survived the ordeal of the blizzard. "Cherokee Winter Camp," Joseph replied after a moment's consideration. 3 days' journey south, in a sheltered valley. My mother's people gather there until the spring hunting season. The revelation surprised Sarah. "Your mother's people? You've never mentioned family before." Joseph was silent for several moments. When he spoke, his voice carried a complexity she hadn't heard before. "My father was a Cherokee scout who married a Cherokee woman. I follow his path, between worlds, belonging fully to neither." The simple statement revealed more about Joseph than anything he'd shared previously. Sarah understood suddenly that his solitary existence wasn't merely preference, but a consequence of his mixed heritage. Too Cherokee for the white world, perhaps not fully accepted by traditional Cherokee. "Either will they welcome me?" she asked, the question encompassing more than just temporary shelter. "They will honor my decision," Joseph answered carefully. "Beyond that, trust must be earned." Preparations continued with practiced efficiency. Joseph had clearly anticipated possible flight, having already packed essential supplies and prepared traveling clothes for both of them. By mid-morning, they stood outside the lodge that had been Sarah's sanctuary and classroom. "Listen," Joseph instructed, orienting her. "Wind from the north, sun on right cheek. We travel south-southeast, following game trails down to the river, then along the riverbank." He placed a walking stick in her hand, the familiar tool now embellished with notches she could feel, directional markers, she realized, that would help her identify north-south orientation by touch alone. "I can't match your pace through deep snow," Sarah acknowledged, anxiety fluttering in her chest despite her determination. "For the first miles you ride," Joseph replied. "Horses can carry both until we reach the river path." The prospect of riding double with Joseph brought unexpected warmth to Sarah's cheeks. Despite the life-and-death practicality of their situation, she found herself acutely aware of the intimacy such arrangement would require. "Ready?" Joseph asked, already helping her mount the sturdy paint horse he'd kept sheltered in a lean-to beside the lodge. "Yes," Sarah replied with more confidence than she felt, settling onto the horse's back. Joseph swung up behind her, his presence solid and reassuring at her back. One arm reached around to hold the reins, while the other secured their packs. The closeness was unfamiliar yet oddly comforting, a physical reminder that she faced this new challenge not alone, but with someone who had already proven his commitment to her survival. As they set off, leaving behind the lodge that had witnessed Sarah's first steps toward genuine independence, she found herself torn between fear of the unknown journey ahead and an unexpected sense of anticipation. Fletcher and the Millers represented her past, a past of limitation and dependence. Joseph and whatever awaited at the Cherokee winter camp represented possibilities she couldn't yet define, but found herself increasingly eager to explore. The horse moved at a steady pace through the snow-covered landscape, following trails invisible to Sarah's perception, but clearly evident to Joseph's experienced eye. The winter air bit at her cheeks, but the fur-lined hood he'd insisted she wear kept the worst of the cold at bay. "Land changes ahead," Joseph murmured near her ear, his breath warm against her cold skin. Descending toward the river valley. "Trail narrows soon. Keep your body centered with mine." Sarah nodded, instinctively leaning back against his chest as the horse began a careful descent. What lay ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty, yet one thing had become clear in the brief, intense chapter of her life with Joseph Blackhawk. She would no longer allow others to determine her worth or dictate her limitations, whatever dangers awaited on their journey to the Cherokee winter camp. She would face them not as the helpless, abandoned woman from the trapper's cabin, but as someone who had begun to reclaim her place in a world that had tried to render her invisible. The journey to the Cherokee winter camp tested Sarah in ways Joseph's careful lessons hadn't prepared her for. 3 days of travel through mountain terrain, crossing icy streams, navigating narrow trails with sheer drops that Joseph described in matter-of-fact terms. Each challenge demanded new adaptations, new courage. On the morning of the 4th day, Joseph halted their progress. "We arrive soon," he said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of tension Sarah hadn't heard before. "Camp lies in the valley below." "Are you concerned about how they'll receive us?" Sarah asked, sensing his hesitation. Joseph was silent for a moment. "My place among my mother's people is complicated. I come and go, bring trade goods, information, not truly of the community." "And now you bring a blind white woman," Sarah added, understanding his unease. "Hardly a valuable trade good." To her surprise, Joseph chuckled, a rare sound that transformed his usually stoic demeanor. "Perhaps more valuable than you know. Cherokee respect those who overcome great challenges. Your journey through blizzard, survival against odds, these deserve consideration." Before they continued, Joseph helped Sarah change into clean clothes. Her original dress, now mended and cleaned, rather than the deerskin leggings and fur-lined jacket she'd worn for travel. "First impressions matter," he explained. "You appear as yourself, not as someone pretending to be Cherokee." The wisdom in this approach struck Sarah. She wasn't trying to abandon her identity, but rather to find a place where that identity, including her blindness, didn't diminish her worth. As they descended into the valley, new sounds and scents reached Sarah's heightened senses. Wood smoke tinged with unfamiliar herbs, children's voices calling out in a language she couldn't understand, the rhythmic thud of something being pounded, grain being processed, perhaps, dogs barking in alert but not alarm. Their arrival didn't go unnoticed. The camp sounded dimmed, momentarily, then erupted in a flurry of activity. Footsteps approached, some running, others measured and deliberate. Joseph dismounted, then helped Sarah down from the horse. "Wayadihi," a male voice called out, speaking in Cherokee, but using Joseph's tribal name, in a tone that suggested both recognition and question. Joseph replied in the same language, his hand remaining supportively at Sarah's elbow. The conversation continued, incomprehensible to Sarah but clearly intense. She stood quietly, acutely aware of being observed by unseen eyes, judged by criteria she couldn't anticipate. Finally, Joseph switched to English. "Sarah, this is Adahi, son of my mother's brother. He speaks for the winter camp while Chief Kanuna hunts in the high country." "Welcome," Adahi said, his English carrying a musical quality, each word precisely enunciated. "Wayadihi explains your situation, unusual circumstances." Sarah inclined her head respectfully. "Thank you for allowing us into your camp. I don't wish to bring trouble to your people." "Trouble follows all who live in these mountains," Adahi replied philosophically. "White man's trouble, Cherokee trouble, all the same snow, different footprints." The poetic response surprised Sarah. Like Joseph, Adahi defied the simplistic descriptions of savages she'd heard all her life. His words carried wisdom and a worldview entirely different from frontier settlements, yet no less sophisticated. "Come," he continued, "council must hear your story. Then decisions." Joseph guided Sarah through the camp, quietly describing their surroundings. 20 lodges arranged in a circle. Central fire pit where the council meets. Food preparation. Areas to the east. Children watch us from behind winter stores. Each detail helped Sarah construct a mental image of the community. Unlike the isolation of Joseph's hunting lodge, the winter camp hummed with collective life. Multiple generations living in close coordination, their survival dependent on shared skills and resources. The council meeting took place in a large lodge near the center of camp. Heat from a substantial fire enveloped Sarah as she entered, along with the scents of cedar, tobacco, and various herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Joseph guided her to a sitting mat, taking position beside her as elders gathered around. What followed was unlike anything in Sarah's experience. The formal council unfolded primarily in Cherokee, with Joseph occasionally translating key points in whispered English. Adahi spoke first, then Joseph provided a detailed account of finding Sarah abandoned, their time at his lodge, and Fletcher's threatening appearance. When Joseph mentioned Fletcher's connection to the Millers and their interest in her father's property, a murmur of discussion spread through the council. Land disputes with white settlers represented an existential threat to Cherokee existence. They understood the significance immediately. Finally, it was Sarah's turn to speak. Joseph's hand touched her arm gently. "They wish to hear from you, directly," he explained. "Your words, your truth." Sarah took a deep breath, turning her face toward the warmth of the central fire. "Honored elders of the Cherokee," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I come before you not by choice, but by circumstance. My own people abandoned me to die in the blizzard. Joseph Blackhawk, Wayadihi, showed me kindness when my blood relatives did not." She continued, explaining her blindness, her parents' deaths, and the Millers' treatment of her. She spoke of Joseph's teaching, the skills she'd begun to develop, and her determination not to return to those who saw her disability as defining her worth. "I understand my presence brings complications," she concluded. "If you wish me to leave when weather permits, I will do so, though I ask for guidance to reach somewhere safe. But know this, I have no desire to bring harm to those who have helped me when others would not." A lengthy silence followed her words. Then an elderly woman's voice joined the conversation, speaking first in Cherokee, then switching to heavily accented English. I am grandmother at Silla. I have lived through 87 winters. I have seen white men come, seen treaties made and broken. Her voice carried the weight of decades of observation. This woman speaks with an honest heart. Her spirit stands straight even when her eyes see nothing. The elders' support surprised Sarah. She bowed her head respectfully, uncertain how to respond. After further discussion in Cherokee, Adahi addressed Sarah directly. Council has questions. Why would these Miller people pursue you so determinedly? What value does your mark on paper hold? I'm not entirely certain, Sarah admitted. My father's farm in Nebraska wasn't particularly prosperous, though the soil was good. The only unusual feature was a stream running through the northern section with strange colored sands. My father thought it merely pretty, but perhaps— She hesitated, pieces falling into place. Perhaps there was gold or another mineral that the Millers discovered after selling the property. Something that requires my signature as the rightful heir to fully claim. This explanation prompted another round of intense discussion among the elders. Joseph leaned close to translate. They debate whether your presence brings danger to winter camp. Some believe Fletcher will not find this valley. Others worry more men will come searching. As the council's deliberations continued, Sarah's anxiety grew. She had no wish to bring Fletcher's violence to these people who owed her nothing, yet the prospect of being sent away, even with Joseph's protection, filled her with dread. Finally, Adahi spoke again, his tone formal. Council has decided. You may remain until the next full moon, 14 days. During this time, we will observe whether pursuit follows and whether your heart is truly as your words claim. Relief washed through Sarah. 2 weeks reprieve. Time to recover, to plan, to consider options beyond mere survival. Wayadihi vouches for you, Adahi continued. His judgment carries weight, though his path often diverges from traditional ways. Grandmother Atsila will share her dwelling with you, teach you our customs while you stay among us. Thank you, Sarah said, emotion tightening her throat. I won't forget this kindness. As the council dispersed, Joseph guided Sarah from the lodge into the crisp afternoon air. First hurdle crossed, he murmured, but many watch, many doubt. Still, will you stay too, she asked, suddenly concerned that Joseph might leave now that she had temporary sanctuary. I remain nearby, he assured her. My mother's family maintains a place for me, though I seldom claim it. For now, we are both guests of the winter camp. Grandmother Atsila approached, her footsteps light despite her advanced age. She spoke briefly to Joseph in Cherokee, then addressed Sarah directly. Come, blind one, my lodge waits. Many things to learn if you stay among Cherokee, even for a short time. As Sarah followed the elder through the camp, guided by the light touch of the old woman's hand on her arm, she entered a world more foreign than anything she could have imagined in her previous life. Every sound, scent, and texture spoke of different ways of being, different values, different wisdom. Yet beneath these differences, Sarah sensed something unexpectedly familiar. A community where contribution mattered more than limitation, where adaptation was celebrated rather than pitied. Whether this world would ultimately accept her remained uncertain, but for the first time since losing her sight, Sarah dared to hope she might find not just survival, but belonging. The attack began, with a single gunshot shattering the pre-dawn silence. Chaos erupted immediately. Shouts from Fletcher's men, answering war cries from Cherokee warriors, the thunderous report of rifles, and the distinctive whistle of arrows cutting through cold air. Inside the medicine lodge, Sarah flinched at each explosion of gunfire, her mind calculating distances and positions based on sound alone. The battle seemed concentrated near the northern edge of camp, where Fletcher's men had first approached. They did not expect us to be prepared, Grandmother Atzilla observed, her calm voice at odds with the violence outside. "They thought they would find us sleeping." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the women waited. Medical supplies ready. Sarah silently recited her father's instructions for treating gunshot wounds, bullet extraction, shock prevention. Knowledge she had never expected to use, but now might mean life or death for those fighting to protect her. The lodge door burst open. Sarah recognized Joseph's distinctive footsteps, though they faltered slightly. "You're hurt," she said immediately, rising to her feet. "Graze only," he dismissed, though the scent of blood contradicted his casual tone. Fletcher circles west, with 2 men, others engaged with warriors at the north edge. Why separate from his men? Sarah asked, already moving toward Joseph, hands seeking the wound she could smell but not see. "He seeks something beyond capturing you," Joseph replied, wincing slightly as Sarah's fingers found the bloody furrow across his upper arm. Or someone, before. She could question him further. Another Cherokee warrior entered, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. Joseph tensed beside her. "What is it?" Sarah asked, hands automatically preparing bandages for his wound. "Fletcher and his men have breached the western perimeter," Joseph translated grimly. "They head directly for Chief Kanuna's lodge." "Why would they—" Sarah began, but Joseph was already moving. "Stay here," he ordered. "This ends now, before." "He could leave," Grandmother Atzilla spoke sharply in Cherokee. Whatever she said made Joseph pause. "Grandmother says truth stands before battle's end," he told Sarah. "She has dreamed this. You must come with me." "To face Fletcher?" Sarah asked incredulously. "To witness," Joseph corrected, taking her arm. Quickly now, they slipped from the medicine lodge into air, thick with gunpowder and smoke. Sarah stayed close to Joseph, trusting his guidance through the unfamiliar chaos of battle. The sounds of fighting had indeed shifted toward the western edge of camp, where Chief Kanuna's lodge stood. As they approached, Joseph pulled Sarah behind a storage structure, his body tense with alertness. "Fletcher speaks with someone," he whispered. Inside the chief's lodge, Sarah strained her ears past the diminishing sounds of conflict. From within the lodge came voices, Fletcher's distinctive drawl, and another that struck her with the force of physical recognition. "Jonathan." "Miller," she breathed, disbelief coloring her voice. "He's here, but how—" "Arrived separately," Joseph surmised. "While Fletcher distracted warriors at the north edge." Sarah shook her head, trying to make sense of this revelation. "Jonathan was supposed to be in California with the wagon train. Why would he be here?" Instead of answering, Joseph guided her. Closer to the lodge, positioning them near enough to hear the heated conversation inside. "You promised me a share," Fletcher was saying, anger evident in his tone. 20% of everything once the papers were signed." "Circumstances change," Jonathan Miller replied, his familiar voice colder than Sarah had ever heard it. "You failed to bring her back from the trapper's cabin. Failed again at the Indians' hunting lodge. Why should I honor an agreement you couldn't fulfill?" "I found her, didn't I?" Fletcher snarled. "Led you straight to this godforsaken camp. My men are dying out there while you hide in here, searching for— What exactly are you looking for, Miller?" A brief silence followed, broken by the sound of items being moved roughly aside. "Not your concern," Jonathan replied. "Where's Abigail? She was supposed to meet us here." Fletcher laughed humorlessly. "Your wife?" "Last I saw, she was still at Fort Collins, spreading some story about seeking her poor blind cousin, lost in the blizzard. Quite the performance. I almost believed it myself." Sarah's mind raced to connect these fragments. Jonathan and Abigail had separated, each playing different roles in whatever scheme they'd concocted. But what could possibly be valuable enough to justify such elaborate deception? The answer came moments later, as Jonathan continued searching the lodge. "It has to be here," he muttered. "The old Cherokee wouldn't part with it, not for any price I offered." "Part with what?" Fletcher demanded. "You've dragged me across half the territory for what exactly?" "The map," Jonathan snapped. "The original survey map of the Nebraska territories, specifically the Holloway property and surrounding lands, the one that shows exactly where the gold vein runs." Sarah's breath caught. Gold on her father's land, the colored sands in the stream that he had thought merely pretty. The pieces suddenly aligned with terrible clarity. "He knew," she whispered to Joseph. "My father must have known about the gold, but kept it secret." "Wise man," Joseph murmured. "Gold fevers make men forget honor." Inside the lodge, Jonathan continued his frantic search. When Dr. Holloway treated Chief Kanuna's son 10 years ago, the Cherokee gave him this map as payment. Sarah's father recognized its value but refused to exploit it, the old fool. But he described it in his journal, which we found after selling the property. "So you sold land with gold on it," Fletcher summarized, "then realized your mistake." "We sold the property based on outdated survey boundaries," Jonathan corrected. "But the original Cherokee map shows the gold vein extends far beyond what we sold, onto lands still unclaimed. With Sarah's signature as Holloway's heir and this map, we could legally claim miles of gold-rich territory." "And you need both," Fletcher concluded. "The map and the blind woman." "Exactly." The sounds of Jonathan's searching grew more desperate. "That's why Abigail insisted we bring Sarah west. We never intended to reach California, just get her away from Nebraska, where someone might question our legal maneuverings. The blizzard provided a perfect opportunity to get rid of her temporarily." "While you doubled back to find this map," Fletcher added, understanding dawning in his voice, "you knew all along the Cherokee had it. Rumors placed Chief Kanuna's winter camp in these mountains. When Sarah disappeared, it created the perfect excuse to mount a rescue that could search Cherokee settlements." Jonathan's voice hardened. "But the map isn't here. Someone's moved it outside." A commotion drew nearer, the sounds of battle approaching the chief's lodge as Cherokee warriors pushed Fletcher's remaining men back toward their leader's position. "We need to leave," Fletcher urged. "Now, with or without your precious map." "Not without Sarah," Jonathan insisted. "Without her signature, the map is worthless." Joseph's hand tightened on Sarah's arm. "Chief Kanuna approaches with warriors," he whispered. "Battle turns in our favor." Sarah nodded, still processing the magnitude of her cousin's betrayal. The Millers had never seen her as family, merely a signature on papers, a legal tool to exploit. The cold calculation of it stole her breath more effectively than the bitter mountain air. Suddenly, a new voice joined the conversation in the lodge, female, familiar, and unexpected. "Looking for this, husband? Abigail?" Jonathan's shock matched Sarah's own. "How did you—" "I arrived before you," Abigail Miller replied calmly. "Played the part of the distraught cousin seeking help from the Cherokee to find poor blind Sarah. They're remarkably hospitable when they believe your intentions are pure." "You found the map," Jonathan stated, relief evident in his voice. "I found much more than that," Abigail replied, her tone shifting to something harder. "I found your second set of papers, the ones that list only your name on the claim, not mine." The silence that followed carried its own weight. "Abigail, I can explain," Jonathan began. "No need," she cut him off. "I understand perfectly. You planned to secure the gold claims, then discard me just as you discarded Sarah." Fletcher's impatient voice broke the tense standoff. "Charming family quarrel, but Cherokee warriors are closing in. We need to leave now, with the blind woman and the map." "Nobody's going anywhere," a new voice announced. Chief Kanuna, his authoritative tone unmistakable even in English. "Except perhaps to the spirit world." Joseph squeezed Sarah's arm. "Time to face the truth," he murmured, then guided her around the storage structure and into the lodge. The atmosphere tensed further as they entered. Sarah could sense the positions of everyone in the room. Jonathan and Abigail Miller facing each other near what must be the chief's sleeping platform. Fletcher presumably near the entrance where Chief Kanuna now stood with his warriors. "Sarah," Jonathan exclaimed, false warmth flooding his voice. "Thank God you're alive. We've been searching everywhere for you." "Save your lies, cousin," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I heard everything. The gold, the map, your plans for my signature, and your ultimate intentions for both me and your wife." A moment of stunned silence followed, broken only by Fletcher's bitter laugh. "Seems the blind woman sees more clearly than any of us." The aftermath of the confrontation in Chief Kanuna's lodge unfolded with swift justice. Fletcher and his remaining men were bound and placed under guard. Jonathan Miller's protests fell on deaf ears as he too found himself restrained beside his former employee. Only Abigail stood apart, the precious map clutched in her hands, her expression unreadable to all but Sarah, who heard the slight tremor in her breathing that betrayed uncertainty. "The map belongs to the Cherokee," Chief Kanuna declared, addressing the assembled tribal council that had convened immediately following the battle. "Given in sacred exchange for Dr. Holloway's healing of my son. Stolen by deception from our winter stores." Abigail's voice remained surprisingly steady. "I simply found what already belonged to my cousin by inheritance. Her father's possessions passed to her." "Except you never intended for me to know about it," Sarah interjected. "The map, the gold, it was all to be claimed without my knowledge." The council lodge fell silent, every eye turning to Sarah as she stood beside Joseph, her posture reflecting a dignity that belied the turmoil of the day's revelations. "What happens now?" she asked, addressing Chief Kanuna directly. "These men came prepared to kill for gold that lies beneath my father's land. Others will follow if they believe the rumors." The chief considered her words carefully. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority earned through decades of leadership. "The map alone proves nothing in white man's law. Your cousin's scheme required your signature on papers claiming the territory. Papers he still possesses," Joseph added, his tone grim. "And connections to legal authorities in Nebraska territory who might not question their validity." Sarah's mind raced through implications and possibilities. The immediate danger had passed, but the larger threat remained. As long as the existence of gold on the Holloway property remained known, people like Fletcher and the Millers would continue to pursue it. And her. "There is only one way to end this completely," she said finally, the solution crystallizing in her mind. "We need proof of their conspiracy, not just for the Cherokee Council, but for territorial authorities. Evidence that can't be disputed or buried." "And how do you propose we obtain such proof?" Jonathan called from where he sat, bound across the lodge. Despite his predicament, his voice carried the same condescending tone he'd always used when addressing her. "Your word against mine would hardly convince a territorial judge, especially coming from a blind woman living among Indians." His dismissal might once have cowed Sarah, but now it only strengthened her resolve. "Not my word. Documentation. Your journal detailing the scheme, the falsified property papers, the original deed to my father's land shows my rightful ownership. Those documents are locked in a safe in Fort Collins," Abigail said quietly. "In the office of a lawyer named Harrington, who's part of the conspiracy. No Cherokee would get within 10 feet of those papers." Joseph, who had remained silent during much of the exchange, stepped forward. "I could." All attention shifted to him immediately. Chief Kanuna spoke in rapid Cherokee, his tone suggesting clear disapproval. Joseph responded respectfully but firmly in the same language. "What are you suggesting?" Sarah asked, sensing tension rising in the lodge. "I move between worlds," Joseph explained simply. "Not fully Cherokee, not fully white. I can travel to Fort Collins, access these documents." Impossible, Jonathan scoffed. Harrington would never... Harrington knows me as Joseph Black Hawk, a half-breed guide who occasionally brings information to military outposts, Joseph interrupted. He has no reason to suspect my interest in Holloway property matters. Chief Kanuna's objections continued in Cherokee, his voice rising with emotion Sarah had never heard from the typically stoic leader. Joseph responded with equal intensity. Though his words remained measured, Sarah touched Joseph's arm lightly. What is the chief saying? Joseph hesitated before translating. He says this journey carries too much risk for too little gain. Those documents in White Man's system have never protected Cherokee lands before and won't start now. And what? Did you tell him, Sarah pressed, that this is not about Cherokee land, but about justice, and that some journeys must be undertaken regardless of risk? The simple statement carried layers of meaning that stirred something deep within Sarah. This man who had saved her from certain death, who had taught her to reclaim her independence, now prepared to risk everything to protect her future. Coming with you, she declared, the decision forming even as she spoke the words. A chorus of objections erupted, from Chief Kanuna, from Grandmother Atsila, who had joined the council, even from Abigail. Joseph alone remained silent, weighing her words with characteristic thoughtfulness. Impossible, Jonathan called again. Fort Collins is at least 5 days' journey through mountain passes. A blind woman would only slow him down, guarantee his capture. For once, your cousin speaks the truth, Chief Kanuna agreed reluctantly. Journey requires speed, stealth. You would become a liability, not an asset. The assessment stung, but Sarah refused to yield. I am the rightful heir to the Holloway property. Any legal challenge to the documents would be stronger with me present to testify. And, she hesitated, then pressed on, my blindness might actually prove advantageous. Who would suspect a blind woman of participating in such a mission? I would be the perfect distraction while Joseph searches for the documents. Joseph's hand settled on her shoulder, a gesture of support that spoke volumes. She understands strategy, he told the chief, and speak the truth about legal matters. Her presence strengthens our position if we succeed. Chief Kanuna deliberated, while the council exchanged opinions in hushed Cherokee. Finally, he addressed them both. Decision is made. Waiadihi may undertake this journey if he chooses. Sarah Holloway may accompany him, understanding the full danger involved. He turned to where Fletcher and Jonathan sat, listening intently. These men remain here under guard. The woman, he indicated Abigail, may choose to stay or depart, but the map remains with Cherokee. Abigail's laugh held no humor. Where exactly would I go? My husband conspired to abandon me just as he abandoned Sarah. I have no more love for him than she does. With the council's decision rendered, preparations began immediately. The journey to Fort Collins would require careful planning, not only for the physical challenges of winter travel, but for the strategic approach to Harrington's office and the retrieval of documents that could end the threat to both Sarah and the Cherokee camp permanently. As Grandmother Atsila helped Sarah gather supplies, the elder woman's hands worked with practiced efficiency despite her age. This journey separates your path from ours, she observed, pressing a small leather pouch of medicinal herbs into Sarah's hands. Whether you return depends on spirits beyond our seeing. I have to go, Sarah replied, carefully stowing the precious medicines. As long as the threat of gold fever hangs over my father's land, neither I nor the Cherokee will ever truly be safe. Not just gold fever drives you, Grandmother remarked, wisdom coloring her voice. Heart follows Waiadihi's path now. Heat rushed to Sarah's cheeks at the direct assessment. He saved my life, she said carefully. I owe him my loyalty. The elder hummed noncommittally. Debt and love walk different trails, blind ones. One ends when payment is made. Others continue beyond the horizon. Sarah had no response to this unexpected insight into feelings she herself had barely acknowledged. As dusk approached, Joseph sought her out where she sat, memorizing the contents of her travel pack, fingers methodically identifying each item and its location for quick retrieval. "We leave before dawn," he said quietly, settling beside her. "Path follows High Ridge first day, then descends to River Valley. Weather is clear for now, but mountain snows come without warning." "I'm ready," Sarah assured him, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. The wilderness had become less terrifying under Joseph's tutelage, but the thought of deliberately venturing back toward settler territory, toward men like Fletcher who valued gold above lives, sent cold fear curling through her stomach. Joseph seemed to sense her apprehension. "Fear is natural," he said simply. "Acknowledging it honors the danger. Controlling it determines survival." "What if we fail?" Sarah asked, the question encompassing far more than the immediate mission. "What if the documents aren't enough, or we can't reach them?" "Then we find another path," Joseph replied. "As we have since the blizzard brought you to the trapper's cabin." His practical certainty steadied her, as it had so many times before. Whatever awaited them in Fort Collins, success or capture, vindication or further danger, they would face it together. That night, as the Cherokee camp settled into uneasy sleep, warriors still standing guard over their prisoners, Sarah found herself unable to rest. Tomorrow she would leave the temporary sanctuary that had sheltered her, venturing back toward a world that had once defined her by her limitations. But she would return a different woman than the one the Millers had abandoned, stronger, more capable, no longer willing to accept others' definitions of her worth. Outside Grandmother Atzila's lodge, the night air carried the promise of frost. By morning, Sarah breathed deeply, committing to memory the sense of pine smoke, cured leather, and medicinal herbs that had become the backdrop of her unexpected new life. Whether she would ever return to this place remained uncertain, but its lessons would travel with her regardless. Tomorrow, she and Joseph would begin their most dangerous journey yet, not merely across physical terrain, but toward a future neither could fully envision. The journey to Fort Collins tested Sarah in ways even Joseph's careful training hadn't prepared her for. 5 days of grueling travel through mountain terrain, navigating icy passes where the wind's howl obliterated all other sound, sleeping in makeshift shelters with danger pressing close from all sides. Yet, with each challenge overcome, Sarah's confidence grew. The woman who had once been considered helpless now moved through the wilderness with purpose, her other senses compensating for lack of sight with increasingly remarkable acuity. On the afternoon of the 6th day, Joseph halted their progress. "Fort Collins lies ahead," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the winter wind. 1 mile, we wait for nightfall." They sheltered in a stand of pine trees, sharing the last of their dried provisions while Joseph outlined their approach. The law office of Samuel Harrington occupied the 2nd floor above the Mercantile on the settlement's main street. According to Abigail's reluctant information, the documents were kept in a safe behind Harrington's desk. "I enter through the rear window," Joseph explained. "You create distraction at the front entrance." Sarah nodded, mentally rehearsing her role. "I'll claim to be a newly arrived widow seeking legal counsel regarding my late husband's estate. Enough truth mixed with fiction to be believable." "When you hear 3 taps on the wall, mention Nebraska territories," Joseph continued. "That signals I've found documents." "And if you don't find them?" Sarah asked quietly. Joseph's hand briefly covered hers. "Then we adapt. Always another path." As darkness fell, they approached the settlement cautiously. The scents and sounds of civilization assaulted Sarah's senses after days in the wilderness. Wood smoke from dozens of chimneys, horses in stables, the murmur of voices from the saloon at the far end of the street. Joseph guided her along back alleys until they reached the mercantile building. "Harrington lives above the office," he whispered. "Light in the window shows he works late." Zara straightened her clothing, her original dress carefully preserved for this moment, and adjusted the shawl covering her hair. "How do I look?" she asked, surprising herself with the touch of vanity in such a critical moment. "Like a woman. With purpose," Joseph replied simply. His hand squeezed hers briefly before he melted away into the darkness, moving toward the rear of the building. Sarah counted to 100 as planned, then made her way to the front entrance. A narrow staircase led to the second floor, each step carefully memorized as she ascended. At the top, her fingers found the doorframe, then the brass nameplate confirming she'd reached Harrington's office. She knocked firmly. After a moment, footsteps approached and the door swung open. "Office is closed for the evening," a male voice announced curtly. "Return tomorrow if you require legal services." Sarah arranged her features into what she hoped was an expression of feminine distress. "Please, sir, I've only just arrived in town. My husband died on the journey west, and I have pressing legal matters that cannot wait until morning." A hesitation, then a resigned sigh. "Very well, madam, please come in." Samuel Harrington guided her to a chair, his demeanor shifting from annoyance to professional courtesy once he'd assessed her as a potential client. Sarah noted how her blindness immediately altered his perception of her. His voice took on that familiar, condescending tone people reserved for those they considered helpless. "Now then, Mrs. Wilson," she supplied, offering the false name they'd agreed upon. "Margaret Wilson, formerly of Ohio." As Harrington settled behind his desk, Sarah focused her acute hearing on the rest of the office. The faint creak of a window opening at the rear confirmed Joseph had begun his part of the mission. Now she needed to keep the lawyer distracted. "My husband left property in the Eastern Territories," she began, launching into the fabricated story. They'd prepared. "I have reason to believe his business partner may attempt to claim it without my knowledge." "Unfortunately common," Harrington replied, warming to a familiar legal problem. "Do you have the deed with you?" Sarah shook her head. "That's part of my concern. The paperwork was lost during our journey. I need to establish my rightful claim before word of Charles's death reaches his partner." As she spoke, Sarah tracked Joseph's nearly silent movement through the office. A barely perceptible metallic scraping suggested he was working on the safe. She extended her story, adding unnecessary details about her fictional husband and their journey west, carefully monitoring Harrington's attention. When 3 soft taps sounded against the wall, so gentle that only her heightened hearing could detect them, Sarah seamlessly redirected the conversation. "The property lies in Nebraska Territory," she said, giving Joseph the signal. "Near Lincoln, where my husband had invested in farmland." Harrington's chair creaked as he leaned forward. "Nebraska, you say? Interesting coincidence. I'm handling another Nebraska claim currently. Quite a valuable piece of land near—" He stopped abruptly, his attention caught by something behind Sarah. Before she could react, the unmistakable sound of a pistol being cocked filled the small office. "Don't move, Indian," Harrington ordered, his professional demeanor vanishing instantly. "Or I put a bullet through your skull." Sarah's heart froze. Something had gone terribly wrong. "I wondered if Fletcher had succeeded in finding the Holloway woman," Harrington continued, his voice hardening. "When he didn't return, I suspected complications. Never imagined you'd bring the prize directly to me." "Sarah, go," Joseph said quietly. "Now." But escape was already impossible. The office door burst open, heavy footsteps announcing new arrivals. "Right on time, gentlemen," Harrington greeted the newcomers. "It seems our Cherokee friend has kindly delivered both Miss Holloway and the documents we've been seeking." Well, a new voice drawled. unfamiliar to Sarah but carrying the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. Samuel Harrington reporting an Indian break-in. Perfect timing, considering Marshal Davis just authorized a search for Cherokee responsible for abducting a blind white woman. Sarah rose to her feet, turning toward the new voice. No abduction occurred. Joseph Blackhawk saved my life when my own family abandoned me to die. That's not how your cousin tells it, ma'am, the lawman replied. Jonathan Miller arrived yesterday, quite concerned about your welfare. Claims you're being held against your will, suffering from confusion after your ordeal. Understanding dawned with horrifying clarity. Jonathan had escaped Cherokee custody, reaching Fort Collins ahead of them to prepare this trap. My cousin is a liar and a thief, Sarah stated firmly. He abandoned me during a blizzard, then pursued me for documents related to gold discovered on my father's property. Documents. Like these, perhaps? Harrington asked, and Sarah heard the rustle of papers, the evidence Joseph had succeeded in retrieving from the safe. Seems to me these legal transfers bear your cousin's name quite legitimately. Nothing here suggests any wrongdoing. Those documents are forgeries, Sarah insisted. My father's property was never legally transferred. Jonathan Miller orchestrated this entire scheme to claim gold found on land that rightfully belongs to me. The lawman sighed heavily. Ma'am, I understand you've been through quite an ordeal, living among savages subjected to who knows what influences. Why don't you come with us? We'll sort this all out once you're safe. She speaks truth, Joseph's calm voice cut through the tension. Proof exists in those papers, if examined honestly. Shut your mouth, Indian, snapped one of the newcomers. You're facing charges serious enough to hang you. Abduction, interference with legal proceedings, assault on Fletcher and his men. Sarah heard Joseph being roughly handled, lightly restrained. Desperation surged through her. They had come so close, only to fall into a perfectly orchestrated trap. Where is Jonathan Miller now? She demanded, changing tactics. If he's so concerned for my welfare, why isn't he here? A moment of uncomfortable silence followed her question. Mr. Miller is securing arrangements for your care, Harrington finally answered too smoothly. Naturally, your condition requires special consideration. My condition, Sarah repeated coldly. My blindness, you mean. The convenient limitation that makes me easy to dismiss, easy to control, easy to declare incompetent. She took a deliberate step forward, fixing her sightless eyes in the direction of Harrington's voice. Except I am not incompetent, Mr. Harrington. I'm the rightful heir to Dr. Edward Holloway's estate. And I believe if you examine the documents my companion retrieved, you'll find evidence of fraud that implicates you directly. Something in her certainty must have struck home. A chair scraped as someone rose hastily. Enough of this, Harrington declared. Sheriff, take both of them into custody. The woman clearly needs medical attention after her ordeal. The Indian will be hanged. For his crimes. Not so fast, Harrington. A new voice joined the confrontation, female, authoritative, and startlingly familiar. District Judge Catherine Wilson, the woman announced. And I believe I'll examine those documents myself before anyone hangs or receives medical attention. The atmosphere in the office shifted instantly. Sarah heard Harrington's sharp intake of breath, the uncertain shuffling of the sheriff and his men. Judge Wilson, Harrington stammered. We weren't expecting the circuit court for another week. Clearly, came the dry response, which makes me wonder why such haste in resolving what appears to be a complex property dispute. Sheriff Brooks, secure those documents. All of them. As the papers exchanged hands, Sarah felt Joseph move closer to her side, his presence steady despite the danger still surrounding them. Margaret Wilson, you called yourself? The judge addressed Sarah directly. An interesting choice of alias, considering. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling slightly. It seemed appropriate given the circumstances. Indeed, Judge, Wilson replied. and Sarah heard the rustle of papers being examined. "These documents certainly warrant thorough investigation. Sheriff, I'm taking jurisdiction of this matter effective immediately. Both Miss Holloway and Mr. Blackhawk will remain in protective custody until a formal hearing can be arranged." "Judge, with all due respect," Harrington began. "Save it, Counselor." The judge cut him off sharply. "I've heard disturbing rumors about gold fever driving unusual legal proceedings in this territory. These documents and Miss Holloway's accusations align rather too neatly with those concerns." She continued in a tone that brooked no argument. "Sheriff, escort Miss Holloway and Mr. Blackhawk to my quarters at the hotel. Post guards you personally trust. And Mr. Harrington, consider yourself under investigation. I strongly suggest you remain available for questioning." As they were led from the office, Sarah felt Joseph's hand briefly touch hers, a gesture of reassurance amid continuing uncertainty. They had survived the immediate danger, but the final outcome remained far from certain. The confrontation had shifted, but not yet resolved. Whatever came next would determine not just the fate of her father's land, but her own future path in a world where gold fever could transform even the most respected citizens into conspirators against justice. Spring arrived in the Colorado Territory. With extraordinary brilliance, or so Joseph described it to Sarah as they stood on the porch of the small cabin overlooking the valley. Wildflowers carpeted the lower meadows in vibrant colors, while the last patches of snow clung stubbornly to distant peaks. The air carried the scent of renewal, pine sap, rich soil, and the sweet perfume of early blossoms. 3 deer at the forest edge, Joseph noted quietly. Doe with 2 yearlings, good sign for the coming season. Sarah smiled, leaning slightly against the porch railing. So much had changed in the 4 months since the confrontation in Harrington's office. The subsequent legal proceedings had unfolded with unexpected swiftness, thanks largely to Judge Catherine Wilson's unwavering commitment to justice. The documents recovered from Harrington's safe had indeed contained damning evidence, not only of the scheme to defraud Sarah of her inheritance, but of a wider conspiracy involving several territorial officials. Jonathan Miller now resided in a Nebraska prison awaiting trial for fraud, while Samuel Harrington had fled the territory, his legal career and reputation destroyed. "Any word from Chief Kanuna?" Sarah asked, turning her face toward the morning. "Son, message arrived yesterday," Joseph replied. "Cherokee winter camp breaks. They move to summer hunting grounds next week." Sarah nodded, a mixture of emotions washing through her. The Cherokee had shown her extraordinary kindness during her time with them. Grandmother Atsila in particular had changed Sarah's understanding of what it meant to navigate the world without sight, not as a diminished existence, but as a different way of sensing and knowing. "They've invited us to visit," Joseph added, his voice carefully neutral, "when summer reaches its peak." The us hung in the air between them, weighted with significance. So much remained unresolved between them, despite all they had survived together. In the aftermath of the trial, with Sarah's legal rights to her father's property firmly established and her independence secured, the question of what came next had grown increasingly urgent. "I received a letter from Abigail," Sarah said, changing the subject slightly. "Judge Wilson arranged for it to be read to me." Joseph made a sound of interest, but offered no comment. Since the trial, where Abigail had ultimately testified against her husband in exchange for immunity, her fate had followed a separate path from Sarah's. "She's in California now. Says she's found work as a seamstress in Sacramento." Sarah traced her fingers along the rough-hewn porch railing, feeling the grain of the wood. "She apologized, in her way. Said she never intended for me to die in the blizzard, only to be delayed long enough for their scheme to succeed." "Cold comfort," Joseph observed. "Yes," Sarah agreed, "but there was something honest in it finally. She acknowledged that she envied my inheritance, resented caring for the blind cousin, while secretly coveting what was mine. She smiled slightly. Ironic that her envy led her here, alone and starting over, while I... She let the thought trail, off, uncertain how to complete it, while I what? Found freedom, discovered strength, learned to trust again. Joseph shifted beside her, his movement as deliberately audible as always, his way of ensuring she could track his presence. Judge Wilson's offer remains open, he reminded her. Position as legal assistant would provide security, respect. During the trial, the judge had taken a particular interest in Sarah's story and her remarkable resilience. Impressed by her intelligence and determination, Judge Wilson had offered her a role helping to prepare cases and organize legal documents, work that required no eyesight but significant mental acuity. It's a generous opportunity, Sarah acknowledged. One I could never have imagined before the blizzard, before Joseph, before discovering that blindness didn't define her capabilities or worth. You would excel, Joseph said simply, his confidence in her abilities as unwavering as ever. Sarah turned toward him, her expression serious. And what of you, Joseph? Would you remain in Fort Collins if I accepted the judge's offer? The question addressed directly what they had been circling for weeks. Joseph had stayed near her throughout the trial and its aftermath, initially as protection, then as something neither had fully named. My path has always moved between worlds, he replied carefully, never fully belonging to either. That's not an answer, Sarah challenged gently. A long silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of spring. Birdsong, the distant gurgle of the stream below the cabin, wind rustling through new leaves. I have received an offer as well, Joseph finally said. The army seeks scouts who know Cherokee territories, good pay, respected position. The revelation shouldn't have surprised Sarah. Joseph's skills were exceptional, his knowledge of the region unmatched. Yet the thought of him leaving sent an unexpected pain through her chest. You would be remarkable in such a role, she said, striving to keep her voice steady. Will you accept? Depends, Joseph replied, and suddenly he was closer, his presence warming the air between them. On what you decide. Sarah's breath caught. My decision affects yours? Yes. The simple admission carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. Sarah Holloway, our paths crossed in a blizzard's fury. Walked together through danger, healing, growth, now stand at a crossroads. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a familiarity born of countless moments of guidance and support. Question is not whether I stay near Fort Collins or travel as a scout. Question is whether our paths continue together or separate. The directness of his declaration stole Sarah's carefully prepared words. Throughout their journey, Joseph had taught her to survive, to reclaim her independence, to trust her own abilities. Never had he suggested she needed him, only that they were stronger together. I've been considering a third option, she said softly, one that's neither the judge's chambers nor army scouting. Joseph waited, giving her space to continue. My father's land in Nebraska is legally mine again, Sarah explained. The gold vein that caused all this trouble runs beneath the northern section, but the southern acres hold rich farmland, land that could support a good life. She turned fully toward him now, reaching up with her free hand until her fingers found his face, tracing features that had become as familiar to her as her own. A life I'd like to share, if you're willing to walk that path with me. Joseph's hand covered hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his cheek. Land between worlds, he observed thoughtfully. Not fully Cherokee territory, not typical settler. Homestead? Exactly, Sarah confirmed. A place where we define belonging on our own terms, where your knowledge of both worlds becomes strength, not division. For a moment, Joseph was silent, considering. When he spoke, his voice carried a warmth she had rarely heard. Such a place would need strong foundations, partnership equal in respect, in commitment. Marriage, Sarah said directly, naming what he had delicately approached. If that's what you're asking, Joseph Blackhawk, my answer is yes. His arms encircled her then, drawing her close in an embrace that spoke more eloquently than words. Sarah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had become her most constant comfort in a world transformed. Cherokee have an expression, Joseph murmured against her hair. When two rivers join, new water flows stronger than either alone. Sarah smiled, understanding the profound truth in the simple metaphor. Their paths, so different in origin yet, aligned through extraordinary circumstances, now merged toward a future neither could have imagined when winter's fury first brought them together. The next morning, they stood together on the porch once more, preparations for departure complete. The cabin, borrowed from a grateful rancher whose daughter had been among those Joseph had guided safely through mountain passes, had served its purpose as temporary shelter during the legal proceedings. Now they faced east toward Nebraska, toward land reclaimed and a life to be built together. "Ready?" Joseph asked, his hand steady at her elbow. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of her father's pocket watch in her dress pocket, the one possession she had carried through blizzard, wilderness, and legal battle. It ticked now, repaired by a Fort Collins watchmaker, marking time not just of days past, but of a future unfolding. "I'm ready," she replied, her voice confident and clear. "The path ahead is long, but I can see it perfectly." Joseph's soft chuckle acknowledged her deliberate choice of words. Together, they descended the porch steps, beginning the journey that would take them not just across physical distance, but into a shared life defined by their own determination rather than others' expectations. Behind them, the Colorado mountains stood as silent witnesses to the extraordinary transformation that had begun in their shadows. How a woman who had lost her sight had found her strength, and how a man who had walked between worlds had finally found his place. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and possibility as they set forth. Two rivers joined, flowing stronger together toward whatever lay beyond the horizon. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.